Hello everyone, Sientir here with another Rambler for you, and today I want to talk some about the structure of the United States. I want to do this because I think it's interesting. I like seeing how systems are put together, what problems they were trying to solve, and how they were trying to be solved, and then also sort of the long-term impacts of those decisions, especially because I think looking at the United States and some of the overarching structure of how it's put together governmentally, that the original problems, or some of the original problems that needed to be solved, have changed, and I think that has had an impact upon the solution that was arrived on by the Founding Fathers. So, when we look at the United States, the idea here is representation. It's a representative democracy, so it's not a direct democracy, which is where all of the citizens would have a vote on everything. That would quickly get out of hand. I'm not sure exactly how many people we have in the United States that are registered to vote. I guess I could look that up real quick, but the point is that it is a fairly substantially huge number of people, and that having them try to vote on every piece of legislation would get aggressively unwieldy. So the Founding Fathers wanted to have a representative democracy. We can see that because that's what we have. And the way that they were choosing who to represent, because this is a very important part of a representative democracy, is you have to figure out how you're going to represent the people. So there's a couple of solutions that we see being used. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is the system currently in place in the United States of America, which is a geographical representation. We have our elected officials, senators, and what do they call the people in the House? Just congresspersons? Whatever. But you have the Senate and the House, and both of these represent geographical locations. And I think you have the same idea going on. I'm not actually sure exactly how state legislatures are set up, and they may be set up differently depending upon different states. But just looking at the federal government, it's set up where you have the House of Representatives that represents districts within the various states, and each state gets a certain number based on its population, and then you have the Senate, where each state gets two representatives to represent the state. And this is to try to balance the interests of smaller states against larger states. So the House would represent a larger quantity of the population more equally, whereas the Senate would represent the states more equally. So there's another way that you can represent people, and that is ideologically or politically. So that's where you get parliamentary systems, where people vote for a party, not necessarily for a candidate per se, though the exact way it can be set up can be a little bit different. But where you have representation within Parliament based upon, and this is my understanding anyway, based upon how the breakdown of the votes work out. So, for example, if you have 5 parties and one party gets, say, 30% of the vote and you have 100 seats, then they would get 30 seats. And then another, say, got 7%, they would get 7 seats, right? So you can kind of work through and say, okay, you're representing this way, so parties that are less popular get fewer seats, but overall you can get these coalitions where it's like, even if the most popular party gets 30%, they don't have a majority of any kind, right? 30% is not a majority. So with the United States, they set it up to represent by location, which makes a lot of sense. The other thing that they did is a lot of stuff to account for distance, because communication technology, back when the Founding Fathers established the United States of America, what you kind of had for your fastest form of communication was a dude on a horse with a letter. So you could get really fast messengers on horses to deliver stuff, but this necessarily limited what could be done. So for example, the Electoral College, part of why I think it was established was because it would be very difficult, potentially, for all of the people throughout all of the states to be able to keep up to date on exactly what was going on. So they would elect electors to go who could be informed and specifically go to do the voting, to represent them. So it's kind of an intermediary representation step. Now, this structure then that we have is very interesting. Now, I'm going to take a moment here and talk a little bit about some of my biases of what I want from government representationally. So in general, I want government to have the most power over the least number of people. So what I mean by that is the focus of the greatest amount of power being over the smallest number of people. So the federal government is over a lot of people. Therefore, I think it should have relatively little power to impact people's lives. Whereas the states are over fewer people, therefore I think they should have more power to impact people's lives than the federal government does. And then I'd say the same thing for like counties. I'm not sure exactly where like the smallest area should be, but basically the lower down, the fewer number of people the government is in charge of, the more authority it has over their lives, because the more authority the people have to hold the government accountable. When you have the federal government with so many people, it's very hard for one individual citizen to help hold it accountable. But when you have, the government over 10,000 people, it's much easier for those voters to be able to hold the government accountable, as opposed to, over 350 million or whatever it is. So that's kind of what my bias is. So I'm, I guess, a federalist where I'd want the federal government to be fairly weak and the state governments to be stronger, and that sort of thing. So that's where my bias lies. But when I look at the United States, something that's happened over the years, and I mean, it happened fairly quickly, that parties became a big deal. But what's happened in particular is there have been a number of things that have really pushed the parties to the fore over the interests of the states individually. So I live in Washington State, and I should not have to care about who, say, Florida is electing to the Senate. But I do care, or at least I have reason to care, because of the political balance of the Senate and the House. One of the things that I've seen happen, or observed to have been the case, is more accurate to say, is that the country is much more interested, I think, in being represented politically than geographically, if that makes sense. Or it certainly feels like it, which leads me to wonder if it would be better to convert either probably the Senate. But see, what we have is we have things like political gerrymandering. If you're not familiar with gerrymandering, it's the idea of when you're districting stuff up. So what happens is to pick people for the House of Representatives. As far as I'm understanding it, I might be wrong here. You have different districts that the states are divided up into. And these districts, there's certain laws, like you cannot racially discriminate when you're dividing them up, right? So you can't say, oh, all of the people here are going to be divided this way based upon their skin color. So that way, say, you minimize the voting power of a specific racial group to represent themselves. But what can happen, and does happen politically, with gerrymandering, that's GERRYMANDERING if you wanted to look it up, is that you have these, I think they do it on a county level. I'm not really 100% positive on that, but you can get these very weird-looking districts. There's ways where you can break it up, so that way you concentrate certain voting blocks within districts, so that way you weaken the power of the other party. So, for example, you can divide things up so that way a district is strongly Republican and you weaken the voting power of Democrat voters, or you can do it the other way around where you make it very Democrat heavy and you weaken the power of Republican voters. And what you end up having, because it's very politically, what's the right term? Sort of politically pure almost. It's not quite the right phrase, but very politically concentrated, ideologically concentrated. You have this issue with political gerrymandering where you don't get proper representation, geographically speaking, of the people in the area. You're doing funny stuff to try to give political advantage to the House. That being the case, then it would make sense to me to say, hey, if we want this to actually represent us politically, let's just make it represent us politically, instead of trying to play games and make it that kind of do this sort of weird thing with the districts. But political gerrymandering is a problem because it focuses the representatives more towards the party that it's weighted towards. So, say, just for example, I'm just going to use Party A. If it's weighted heavily towards Party A, then what you end up having is people have to appeal to Party A voters in order to be able to get elected. So they're running within that party. They're not competing with the other party, which pushes towards the extreme of Party A. This then creates certain levels of extremism and makes it that way sort of the job of a lot of Congress people, a lot of people in the Senate and the House, is to get reelected, which I think is a problem. There should have been term limits on the Senate and the House, I think. I don't think somebody should be able to be a career politician in one area, so I think you'd have to move around from state legislature to national legislature to different parts of that to different types of positions, governorship, different things like that. I'm really a big fan of term limits. I don't think somebody should be a career politician. Now, there are some arguments in favor of it, of knowing how the system works, but the problem is they also get comfortable with how the system works. And it also means that there's too much of a focus on getting reelected. One of the problems that we have is the influence of money through campaign contributions, because that determines who gets elected and how that goes. And that's a real big problem. And this is where there's lots of calls for campaign finance reform It's proven difficult to do for various reasons. And so you have a lot of the Congress people spending their time trying to get reelected and asking for campaign contributions. So kind of what my whole point is with this is just kind of look at the system. So you have wanting to represent the people geographically, so that way the interests of different geographic regions could be represented. Right? That's what the Founding Fathers were doing. And they're saying, okay, we originally were set up with states. That's how the different colonies formed, is they formed different states. And then these states kind of came together to form a larger country. So each state has a legislature, has its own governing body with a governor over it, naturally. And then the federal government presides over the states. The states would have within themselves ways of representing their individual citizens, and then the states themselves would be represented in the federal government, both on a per state level as well as on a per citizen region. These are the districts within the states. And these numbers would be based on population. And again, the idea here is that it would allow small states to have more say relative to the large states in the Senate, and the large states more say relative to the small states in the House of Representatives. This would therefore provide two measures of kind of balancing things. And a lot of people, especially at the beginning, were very focused on their state, not on the federal government. As time has gone on, more emphasis has been placed on the federal government, and more emphasis has been placed on political parties relative to geographic distribution, which I think we either need to own those transitions and admit, no, this is how we actually are, or we need to say, wait, these aren't changes that we want to have. This transition is something we want to try to walk back. There's arguments both ways. Now, like I said, my personal bias is to reduce the power of the federal government relative to the states, make the states a lot more important, and overall emphasize the individual states, because I think it is easier to hold a state government to account by its citizens than it is to hold the federal government to account by the citizens, just on a function of scale. So that's where my bias is. What I would want to do, for example, is, say with taxes, I wouldn't want the federal government to tax citizens directly. I'd want it to tax the state governments because that's what it's over, and stuff like that. But I'm a programmer and I like strict hierarchies, and what we have feels very hacky, and it's like, yeah, okay, I guess, but not something I'm happy about. The problem also, by the way, that I have with the federal government trying to govern too broadly is that the needs of individual regions are very different. So legislation that is enacted to care for problems in one region might have very adverse effects in another region. A really good example of this is minimum wage. Now, there can be arguments and debates about what minimum wage is supposed to do and all sorts of things. But just as a simple point, the cost of living is different in different areas. If the goal of minimum wage is to make it be so that way people can have a living wage, then what is necessary in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming, versus New York City or Seattle or San Francisco or Los Angeles is very different. Because the cost of living in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming, or a small town in Alabama, or a small town in Indiana, or even a small town somewhere else in Washington State, for example, like where I live, the cost of living in the Seattle area versus the cost of living in like Spokane are different. The minimum wage, therefore, realistically speaking, ought to be different in different areas because the costs of living are different in different areas. And when you raise the minimum wage, it does create a ton of pressure on people who are making jobs to be able to afford that minimum wage employee. And you're already seeing issues with like McDonald's and other things going to robots, but I'm not going to get into that right now. Just the basic premise of what you need to have a living wage, what a living wage actually is, differs from region to region. So there's not a one-size-fits-all solution in terms of minimum wage, in terms of what you'd want that to be. And generally speaking, you want the minimum wage to be as low as possible just because that makes more jobs available, or as low as reasonable is perhaps a better way of phrasing that. Again, because the higher it is, the more pressure it creates on how many employees you can have and things like that. So what you then basically have, and this is just one example, but you have different policies that need to apply differently in different areas because the needs and requirements are in just the state of things are different in different spots. So that's part of also why I personally want the greater governing power over a fewer number of people. this transition that we've seen over time to being very, very ideologically focused rather than geographically focused, where we're saying our representatives are to represent us in a political ideological sense more than in a state needs sense, I think is a consequence of the federal government increasing in overall power relative to the states. In turn, that does make me think some sort of parliamentary system, converting one of the houses or adding one of the House of Representatives or the Senate, or adding a separate body to be a parliamentary system makes a lot of sense, just to try to say this is how we're being represented now. But anyway, this has been kind of a true rambler, I think, this time. So as the recording approaches 20 minutes, I'm just going to go ahead and wrap up here. Again, I want to talk about this just because I think it's interesting. It's interesting to see sort of the problems that they're trying to solve with how do we represent these people in a way that works well given the vast geographic spread and the vast differences between regions and the different needs between different states. And they came up with a solution, and that solution worked, I think, pretty well for the time. But as things like communication technology have changed, and as the relative power of the federal government has grown, and things like that, what we have is a system that was designed to solve a set of problems that have changed to some extent. And I think it's always worth it to consider, is there a slightly different system that would work better with what we have now, with the problems that we need to solve now? And I don't really expect anything to dramatically change at the federal level or with the way things are governed, but I just wanted to express my thoughts and my opinions on it, and hopefully I've done so. So until next time, everyone, you can contact me directly at sientir@gmail.com. You can like me on Facebook at facebook.com/sientirsramblers, and you can support me financially on patreon.com/sientir. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.